Good morning. Um, so I'm going to be talking about what the opportunity is there from an analytics and AI in retail perspective. You would probably have seen a lot of numbers, data, facts, but sometimes it's important to put it in context of what some of this data really means. Um, there's a very famous astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who some of you may have seen on the Big Bang Theory show. Anybody seen Neil deGrasse Tyson? Right? And he talks about the importance of communication and humanizing data. And there was a point of time a few years back that there was a lot of uproar about the amount of money that NASA was spending on sending people to space, sending satellites to space. And the number which was floating around was $3 billion. $3 billion NASA is spending, and Neil deGrasse Tyson had to go and defend that. And he actually humanized it. He said, first of all, that number is going to be spent over a 7-year time period. The second is, he said, in that time period, Americans will spend more on lip balm than this, right? So just contextualizing data in terms of what we are talking about really makes a difference. So before I get into the numbers that you see on this page and sort of try to bring that to life and humanize that, I think just laying out where we are starting off today. If we look at it, of course, the last few years have been tough for retail, for especially the period 2020 and 21. If you look at what has happened from a global retail perspective, I would put it still in sort of the red zone. But if you look at Indian retail, it has come into the green zone. Now, two important things to highlight, caution here is averages sometimes are misleading. So actually, if you think about it, over the 2.5 year period, India's total GDP really came back to where it was in 2020 or so. However, one big difference which has happened is if you look at the overall GDP, roughly $2.8, $2.9 trillion, if you look at the composition of that, we believe that has really changed. And what has happened is consumption towards the top end actually has increased. Consumption in the middle is the one which has reduced. Because actually, if you look at the consumption at the bottom, which is pure necessities, that has not really changed that much. What has really reduced is the one in the middle, the discretionary value equivalent part, that has come under pressure, while the top end of the segment actually has grown. That's one part. The second is if you manifest that in terms of geographies, categories, etc., you would find that when you talk to retailers across different categories and segments, you hear very different story in terms of how the business is growing. So while on an average it has been back in the green zone, if you look at the average view, there are parts which have actually got into greater deep, greater green, while there are some which are in the amber zone. Now, the one thing which has happened over these last 2.5, 3 years is a continuation of something which has been happening for the last few years, which is the importance of data, the importance of what are the enabling technologies which actually make the data processing better, faster, and more relevant for retailers. A few years back, and actually more than close to 20 years back, I was having a conversation with the then person from ICICI Bank, Nachiket Moore. And he made a very interesting observation. He said, actually, many of the retailers in India use biometric technology. And I was surprised. I said, really? He said, yes. When somebody walks into a store, in a small shop, the retailer actually uses his vision, uses his hearing to figure out who the customer is, then uses his central processing unit to figure out what has happened and gives a personalized offer. Right? So you actually see that both the data capture as well as the translation of that into a personalization offering was something which has been happening. What has really changed is rather than it being decentralized and being driven by individuals, how do you actually build that knowledge capability centrally and then are able to execute it in a decentralized manner? That's really the thing which has happened. Now, again, contextualizing some of this. So if I was to tell you that by 2025, estimate is that we would generate about 150 to 175 zettabytes of data, I would get a blank look. What is a zettabyte? It is a trillion gigabyte. Again, you know, the human mind is not able to process this much information. But what if I told you that if we were to put all this information on DVDs and we would stack them around the earth, we would actually have DVDs which would go around the earth 200 times the circumference of the earth. That's the amount of information that we are processing, that we are creating. And we actually, interestingly, now have the ability to process that information as well. And we have examples of what retailers are doing in order to process that information. If you look at this curve, you know, what you see at the bottom left is just in terms of what happened, moving to why it happened, and then in terms of what could potentially happen. And we are climbing across these steps as we move ahead. Now, is it ideal that we move to the last stage, which is please do it for me, which can lead to unintended consequences, or should we stop one step or two steps before that? The work that BCG has done actually indicates that depending on where we are, it actually may make sense to keep oneself to the left of this page, bottom left, or to the top right. And there have been multiple examples that you will see in this report that we have come out, which is in detail. I will not go through in depth of that, but there are multiple use cases which we have seen retailers across categories, across geographies use in order to improve their top line and bottom line. When we were thinking about what the report should be, what the title of the report should be, actually the way we thought about it was it should lead with value. Retailers at the end of the day are a business, and all of the AI, analytics, etc. that is being done is in order to create genuine value both for the shareholders and for the customers, which is there. And we believe that the opportunity which is there is close to 400 billion rupees incremental EBITDA. 40,000 crores incremental EBITDA is the opportunity, a combination of margin and growth which can get unlocked. The interesting thing is, how does this growth get unlocked? How does this value get unlocked? Is it just because of the magic of the data analytics, or is there more to that? One of the things that we found that in most analytic projects, it's less about the data, algorithm, and so on, which is 10 and 20%. Actually, a large part is driven by the 70%, what you see below the waterline in terms of making change happen. How do you get people to change behavior, whether it's in terms of merchandising, whether it's in terms of in-store, whether it's in terms of pricing? So making that change happen is the more important and the more difficult part, rather than coming with the actual insight. An experiment that my team also did was to say, what if we actually have this report written by AI chatbot? And this is the actual example that you see, that you, when you ask chat.gpt to write a report on Indian retail. At the first level, you may actually find that there's nothing wrong in what has been written. And that's exactly my point in terms of when we think about making this happen. At the first level, it is easy to say that let's use data to actually make some of this happen that we were talking about. But the 70% is the one which is difficult. I'll just give one example. We were working with a leading fashion retailer in order to come out with what should be the designs which should be sold next season, designed next season. The first part of the experiment was to say, actually let the data come up with its own answers. And lo and behold, between pilot and control, you found that what was being designed by the designers and merchandisers versus what the AI was recommending, the AI was better off by about 15 to 18%. The sell-through rates were better. But then we said, what if you combine the human and the AI together? So what we did was the AI actually generated the options, but the final selection was done by the merchandisers and the designers. The result was a staggering 43% improvement in the sell-through rates. So how do we get the right blend of the analytics, of the data, and the human side is an important consideration as we think about what should be the way forward for analytics in retail. And then some success factors, looking at both what companies which have done this well and not so well, what are some of the things that come out. What you see on this page, I think going a big, bold move is fraught with danger. So taking a test and learn approach makes sense. Pilot control, the kind of things that I was talking about. It is sometimes easy to think that this can be outsourced to somebody. And despite the fact that we actually end up doing this with some of our clients, we believe it's important for companies to build part of this capability in-house rather than outsource it to anyone. So what are the capabilities to be built in-house? The single biggest driver of success or failure of this is actually the top management conviction, sponsorship around the same. So if there is one advice that I would have is, if your senior team, if your CEO, if your founder is not convinced of the need to do this and is not backing this 110%, actually don't go down this path. But if and when you go down this path, think about what can be done in order to really capture this opportunity which is there to drive value for you and your business is something to think about. Really, let me just end with one note. Over the last so many years that I've been a part of RAI, I think there are some things which have been consistent. I think there has been one consistent theme which is just the conviction around India. And if at this point of time we don't have conviction in India, I don't know when we would have. The second, I think, is the ability to think about new and different things as we think about the future. And when I was thinking about today's session, the one reflection I had was it's not as if what we talk about every year is dramatically different from what has been talked the previous year. But if I look at what was talked about 10 years back versus today, there is a big difference. So if you look at just every year, it's not as if there is many new things which are coming out. But if you look at how far Indian retail has moved over the last decade, over the last 2 decades, it's really a lot. On that note, I wish you all the very best for this year and hope that all of you get your fair share of the 40,000 crore opportunity.